Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claire Reedy, and I'm the Program Manager at the Health Federation of Philadelphia for the Mobilizing Action for Resilient Communities, or MARC initiative. I'm joined in the room by my colleague, Carolyn Smith-Brown, and we're delighted to have you all with us today for the MARC Brown Bag webinar series. Now, before I get started, I have a couple of notes. This session is being recorded and will be archived on the MARC website. At the moment, all participants are muted, so please use the questions pane on your GoToWebinar control panel to share your comments or questions, which we'll be addressing at the end. Mobilizing Action for Resilient Communities is a learning collaborative of 14 cross-sector networks that are using the science of adverse childhood experiences to build the movement for a just, healthy, and resilient world. MARC is coordinated by the Health Federation of Philadelphia with support from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the California Endowment. You can read more about the communities participating in MARC on our website. We're also posting monthly to our shared learning series, in which you can read about key themes emerging across sites and get related resources. MARC has an impressive National Advisory Committee, and I'm sure many of you recognize some of the names and faces here. We're very thankful that they have graciously agreed to take on this webinar series. You can visit the MARC Brown Bag webpage to see the lineup of webinars, access the archives, and register for upcoming sessions, including our August 1st session with our advisor, Dr. Angelo Giardino, on building resilient communities at the interface between public health and hospital systems. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Christopher Blodgett. Dr. Blodgett is a Washington State University faculty member and a licensed clinical psychologist. He's been the principal investigator for more than 36 federal and national foundation grants addressing high-risk children and families. Currently, he is the director of the CLEAR Trauma Center at Washington State University, and CLEAR stands for Collaborative Learning for Educational Achievement and Resilience. Dr. Blodgett and his team partner with communities and systems to adapt the science of resilience, brain development, and trauma treatment to better address trauma resulting from childhood adversity. Now funded by multiple federal and philanthropic grants, this work documents the profound and immediate consequences of ACEs and tests practical actions to improve child, family, and system outcomes. Chris, it's a real joy to have you as part of the MARC Advisory Committee, and I'm delighted that you could join us today. So I'll turn the webinar over to you now.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for taking time in your July busy Mondays to spend some time on this particular topic. Let me briefly give you a little bit of background about the work that we've been doing. We've actually been formally engaged in trauma-informed schools work now for about 12 years. Started really very much in learner mode, trying to understand how to work effectively with schools and how to start to translate these concepts effectively into educational practice. And then for about 8 years now, we've actually been funded on the ground in developing the CLEAR intervention model in early learning and K-12 programs. We've been now in more than 40 sites doing this work. We're currently doing work in California, Oregon, Washington, and looking to open in New York State and Alaska this coming fall. So we've been having kind of a ringside seat of how rapidly this conversation has emerged nationally around the relevance of understanding adversity, trauma, and resilience as it applies to educational practice. I think one of the things that I've learned in doing this work over the last 12 years and being pretty immersively engaged is that when people tell me that they do trauma-informed practice, my standard response now is tell me more, because I think we're in a period of extraordinary experimentation, and the windows that we look into trauma and adversity and resilience through certainly share a lot of common components, but there are also a lot of differences, and there is not a lot of consensus yet about what does this practice actually mean. So I'm going to talk about that, and then I'm going to talk to you about briefly about what we do in CLEAR, but more I want to try to highlight what we've been learning that I think are generalizable lessons. And work we do right now is beyond working in the early learning and K-12 educational systems. We're also progressively getting involved with primary health care, and we think that lessons that we're learning in education are generalizable to any kind of complex, and particularly any complex and stressed system that serves children and families. So let me talk just kind of really briefly about where I think we are in terms of the current practice. If I had better art skills, I would have done this as a Venn diagram to really try to give some sense of what seems to be driving the field right now. But let me start by saying that I think that what dominates currently is local and self-organized efforts. People get profoundly personally impacted by the information of adversity and how that lines up with the personal experience as well as their professional experience, and then they feel this deep ethical need to start to address these issues. So from my perspective, working around these issues in schools, overwhelmingly, when we talk about trauma-informed schools practice, we're talking about this whole process of how people have engaged these conversations through the vision that they have locally. What we have seen emerge is that there are self-guided strategies that are a bit of a black box for us in terms of what people are doing, but we also have seen some guidance that's been coming out in more formal, almost how-to guides, and I would particularly highlight the work of the Massachusetts Advocates for Children, but also Bruce Perry's neurosequential model of education is a good example of how it is that you can do some kind of concentrated training or orientation and then try to move this conversation forward in local settings. Right now, we are sitting in those areas where it is a black box. We have a lot of trouble knowing some of the specifics of what people are doing, and it's impacting a bit on how we collect information about the scale of impact that we're having. If we come at this through the lens of where is our best body of evidence for what we should invest in, it clearly comes out of mental health in schools, where we're talking about the most vulnerable kids and the kids that are in greatest need of formal services. So at this point, 35 years into mental health treatment of trauma, we have multiple trauma-informed evidence-based practices that can be either co-located or done in coordinated fashions with mental health providers. I mentioned in the slide CBITS, which is Cognitive Behavior Intervention for Trauma in Schools, which is probably one of the best known of the brief psychoeducational interventions that have developed principally around the issue of acute trauma. But when we end up seeing this work, what's I think important to recognize is that where the evidence base is very strong, the reach is really about that real vulnerable 15 to 20% of kids who are in need of formal services. Then the third kind of array of work is more where the work of my group sits, but we're certainly not alone in doing this. And that's really more formal intervention strategies and ones that are particularly and explicitly focusing on the issue of systems change. How do we move beyond individual practice to establishing the norms and practices? So in addition to the work that we do in CLEAR, I would call out the work of Turnaround for Children and Sanctuary as two of the other models that have got a pretty strong presence in schools. All of the work that comes through the trauma-informed schools perspective, though, also is really significantly overlapping and supported by and informed by work that doesn't use that trauma framework in order to be able to try to advance the well-being of kids. Social emotional learning is, I think, now dominating in educational practice in the United States, and this is a universal practice about competencies, not explicitly there to address the issue of the impact of trauma. But the concepts are so aligned and so consistent in terms of the work that we're doing that from our perspective, social emotional learning practice is a trauma-informed practice. It may end up hitting some limitations, though, in terms of really addressing to how trauma changes us in the decoding and response that needs to follow as a consequence of understanding what trauma does to us. But programs I'm sure that you're familiar with are positive behavior interventions and support, or PBIS, and then increasingly we're seeing a lot of adoption of Ruler out of Yale as a program that has been getting a lot of visibility and focus in schools. And then finally, I would focus on the techniques and philosophy associated with restorative practices, which is another place where you ended up seeing, not coming out of the origins around trauma and adversity, but more of a social justice lens and how that applies into safe and responsible school response. So we have a very complicated landscape in which this work is being done. I think it's important to recognize science got us here. So we're working from a tremendous body of information about what we understand about the biology of stress and its developmental consequences and the adverse childhood experiences that increasingly are seen as kind of the centerpiece for how we start to talk about what social cost can be, both in health and in education. So where science has gotten us here, science is something that we're trying to build right now in terms of the work. So we're in a place where we have good direction, but not a lot of consensus about what should be the focus of the work that we're doing. Although the work that my group has done has been focused through a particular lens on dealing with this, my own view is what we need to do is celebrate and recognize the importance of all the approaches that are currently going on. But this is a period of learning. It's a period of trying to understand, and it means increasingly the issue of what works and what can start to be characterized as core practice increasingly has got to be part of the conversation that we're having. So this issue of science got here, but science is still a body of work that we need to do. To us, and the work that we've done has come through one very particular lens, and the lens is referred to as implementation science. So very briefly, implementation science arose really with the rise of evidence-based practice, both in medicine and social services. And one of the early points of recognition around the issue of evidence-based practice is that we collectively across all fields have had tremendous amount of trouble actually being able to scale up and replicate the success of well-resourced, highly structured demonstration projects about specific evidence-based interventions. So concurrent with the rise of evidence-based practice was a whole body of work around implementation science that basically said, is it knowable about why we fail in terms of doing this work? So we've come down very strongly on this issue about the importance of understanding the process and not just the tools and the techniques that we use. So I don't want to spend very much time here other than if implementation science is a new concept for you, I would strongly encourage you to investigate this. This is from the National Implementation Research Network, which is work particularly of leaders in the field, Donna Blodgett and Dean Fixon. Their work is available for free on the web. They have a very deep website through the NERN program that deals with this. But what I really want to highlight here is this perspective about what we need to focus on to get to success is actually an understandable set of targets. And when we ignore our design on these issues, we really put our work in peril and make it very difficult for us to get to the innovation uptake that we're looking for. Start on the left here on the competency drivers. One of the things that I would really highlight that are parts of attention, particularly working in schools, is that this issue of staff selection, of how it is that we really try to think about the preparation and the commitment of the people that are doing this work. In education, we don't really have that option to really deal with this. We're going in and doing whole staff development training most of the time, and that creates its own set of challenge about the readiness, the literacy goals that we have to get to technique. And if we focus too greatly on technique without thinking about the sequence here, we really can set people up to fail. Second point, again, on competencies is quality and consistency of what we train to. I think my experience has been that we've, to some significant degree, made the error of believing that training is an intervention in its own right. And actually what we know about adult learning is that that's not correct. That the key aspects of what takes people to a different level in their practice is to be exposed to new information, to be able to practice differently, and then critically to be able to reflect on what it is that their shift in practice is. And that brings up in the upper left of the competency drivers this issue of coaching. But what I'd also point out, I'm not going to spend any time, is that really looking at this as an organizational capacity set of issues on the right, and the issue of leadership roles become also the critical things that we need to think about of all moving parts that have to be brought together in a real synergistic way to actually get to the results that we want. We believe deeply, and why I've been happy to be an advisor in the MARC process, is that ultimately this conversation shouldn't be about adversity and trauma, that those are waypoints in our understanding, but it's really about growth and it's about resilience. So one of the criticisms often that's directed at resilience is that this is a rather abstract set of concepts, and I would actually push back against that pretty strongly and say that actually working with resilience is a pretty concrete set of targets that we deal with, and it has to do with quality of belief, skills, and the quality of the environment that we end up working with. And I just want to highlight a few things off this slide. The first duty that we've got is to instill hope. One of the most sobering journal articles I've read in my career was really about the issue of multicultural education, and particularly that of urban African American youth. And in pretty well-designed survey work that's been done, what African American youth were saying about their relationship to education is that they believe that education is the pathway to a better life. They just don't believe that often it applies to them as an individual. So we get this disconnect between hope and a sense of a belief in the future, and that becomes a focus for how it is that we need to think about every one of our interactions with children. But this also comes down to, particularly as a developmental issue generally for all kids, but for what trauma does and takes from us, it's the issue of the skills that we need to really be thinking about. And there's a sequence when we look at this through a trauma lens that says critically it's emotional regulation and a tolerance for change, it's relationship skills, and we only get to executive function, the ability for planned and ethical choices, when we get the first two parts of that right in terms of us as social beings. And then finally, this issue of environment. How do we create repairable and forgiving settings when somebody can fall down and still have an opportunity to re-engage and have relationships get supported? But we need to keep our eyes on the focus here, which is that of resilience. So we've got a very good map of the what when we think about adversity and what we understand about trauma. What we've found is that tying this conversation unapologetically to the issue of trauma and the fact that we walk into schools where 1 out of every 2 children or more come with significant adverse childhood experience backgrounds, is that trauma ends up being the first place where we're actually able to push the system towards a different focus on effort. So where we've moved in our work, and I expect it's also reflective for many of you on this call, is really coming at this through the lens of complex trauma. Complex trauma is the complementary mental health term to adverse childhood experiences. So it is this issue of early exposures that pile up at critical times of development. It's understood through the mechanisms of the impact of toxic stress and developmentally, what does that do to us biologically? But from the complex trauma literature in mental health, what we've done for the last 12 years is really focused on the issue that there is a consensus set of recommendations that have come forward in the work that has been done in mental health, and that from this we can translate these best practice recommendations about the point of focus into educational practice. So one of our kind of stock phrases is we don't want teachers to be therapists. What we think is that application of these ideas help them be better teachers. If we look at the kind of threads that are consensus recommendations that have come out of complex trauma, we would really highlight 2. The first one is that what trauma does to us is it steals an essential sense of safety. It steals it typically very early in life because we know that adverse childhood experiences, when piling up in life, usually occur well before the age of 5 and often well before the age of 3. And that means that we take the stress from adversity and encode it biologically because we do not have language or perspective to be able to make sense of loss and trauma as we would as adults. So when that's the case, this issue of the loss of safety becomes this kind of critical thing to teach to. And it's expression and the way that you take that into a classroom or into dynamics within a building is to really focus on the issue of the role of triggers. And again, I expect that's a very familiar concept, so I'm not going to spend much more time, but I really wanted to highlight on this issue of the critical nature of bringing safety to the center of how we understand behavior in both children and adults, because this is equally true for what you see as in the professionals as they deal with the stress and triggering events that they face. But the second major thread, and it's not an either or, these things are interwoven in any one of us as human beings, is this issue of how need drives behavior. So we mostly were trained in functional behavioral analysis to think about the antecedents of behavior and the consequences through a learning theory perspective. What we think the shift that we make is to really extend that concept to functional needs analysis. So what we're really trying to understand when we're trying to decode human behavior through a trauma lens is what is the need that's driving the behavior. Consensus arguments would say that there are three. The first one is emotional and relational needs. Second is the drive to mastery and a sense of personal efficacy. But in many instances, you'll end up seeing this come down with children to really kind of concrete physical needs. One of the things that's been very striking as I've done work in schools is how common hoarding behaviors, particularly of food, is in children. And the reason why I just want to pause on that, because mastery and relational needs I expect are fairly familiar with you, is that when you see the physical needs come out in children, we move very quickly to pathologize that behavior because it freaks us out. It is so unusual and so difficult for us to get a frame around what's going on. We very quickly go to mental health issues. But the key issue about safety and needs development through a trauma perspective is that at one time, these were adaptive strategies. These were ways that the child and adolescent and the adult had survived. The disconnect is it doesn't work in the current situation any longer. So safety seeking, needs fulfillment as the two kind of thematic issues that we found tremendous purchase in being able to train to these issues and build skills about both identifying and building alternative responses. If you look at this through the systems perspective, what has come in education is what's referred to as multi-tiered systems of support. So that's often organized in three tiers, where tier one is universal practice in the classroom. Again, from our perspective, the precondition for moving forward in trauma-informed practice is to really invest in strong social emotional learning practices that are universal in nature. But the second part of what we've found our work is really focused on is professional skills development in how to use concepts of adversity, trauma, and resilience in order to individualize instruction and classroom management practices. Where this is beginning to change right now in certain parts of the country, mostly in pre-service educational preparation through universities and colleges as folks are moving out to become teachers. They're not getting trained in these issues. Mostly when teachers have gotten skilled at these issues, they got skilled through the day-to-day experiences that they've had in classrooms, not through the formal presentation. So we have a real gap in terms of understanding of child development, understanding of child behavior, but particularly the issue of adversity, its impact on trauma. So we have a very targeted set of skills development roles with education that we really need, educators that we really need to focus on. Tier two is when kids begin to really struggle and can't benefit from good classroom practices. And at that point, the goal from our perspective is brief psychosocial supports, but it's really introducing into the conceptualization for the educators on behalf of the student. How do we understand if developmental trauma, complex trauma, is part of what we're confronting with this kid? Again, our experience and our data ends up saying that particularly in lower income schools, both rural and urban, this will be the dominant issue. That doesn't mean that you don't have acute trauma through loss, through natural disasters, through a variety of other kinds of issues that are important to deal with. But what is stopping education from succeeding with many kids is this issue of complex trauma. And then finally, for 15%, 20%, sometimes higher, what we're dealing with are kids who are being really functionally limited in a pretty dramatic manner in terms of their ability to explore. And when possible, this issue of coordinated response that includes at Tier 3 formal mental health treatment services is part of the goal. Our practical experience, particularly here in the West, is that when we move out of urban settings, the resources that are available start and end in the school, but the need of the kids don't. And how to figure out how to have a full Tier 1 to Tier 3 response when you're limited in your resource becomes one of the great challenges we've been trying to work through. So let me talk really quickly about what our intervention is. We are a systems-focused change mechanism. And one of the things we took out of the organizational change literature is that whether you're a Toyota assembly line or an elementary school in Seattle, Washington, change takes time. And a good estimate about adoption of innovation of practice is you can't get out in less than 3 years of work. So we are a 3-year intervention program. We're also primarily not a professional education program in the sense of training, although it is part of what we do. We're actually principally a coaching intervention. So we place a trauma specialist in a building 2 days a month for 3 years. And what we focus on in doing that is first a sequenced high quality professional development series, but we do that 1 hour a month over 2 years. And we believe that one of the things we've learned is the power of persistent, brief, and cumulative training. And one of the striking aspects of this is that this 1 hour a month series of trainings keep people in the presence of the information in a fairly powerful way. What we also have learned is that we need to communicate and culturally begin to really focus on a shared approach and shared language. We use significantly an intervention model out of mental health called attachment, self-regulation, and competence. But we also work with this other set of ideas, which maybe in the questionnaire we can get into a bit. What we've learned doing this work is the one thing that does not occur in education is an opportunity to pause and reflect. And one of the things that we found in the coaching approach is how critical it is to start to create that space. So one of the things that we can do as the coaches is create small periods of time. It can be 5 minutes to half an hour with this, but that it becomes a critical investment to create this kind of reflection space. The other thing that we've learned is that if you cannot bring leadership in a building, both the formal designated leaders and the principal, assistant principal, but also peer leadership, forward in their work as a leadership function to adopt these ideas, then we can't succeed. When we've lost principals who have been disengaged and not invested in this work, our experience is you cannot take this work forward successfully. So I can't stress enough how important leadership functions are. Really quickly, this is the attachment, self-regulation, competence framework. We are a formally acknowledged adapted model of ARC. So you'll note in the lower part of the slide, this is really the work of Margaret Blaustein and Christine Kinneberg. What we have liked very much about the ARC model is that this is a consensus argument about the targets, and each of these building blocks is really how you unpack skills. But it critically reinforces this issue of relationship and attachment as foundational. Self-regulation becomes the next stage that you're dealing with in competencies. Executive function, new learning, the ability to move forward effectively can't occur until you get those first two foundational bodies of work established. I'm going to end on talking just really quickly about our findings. Like a lot of programs in trauma-informed practice, we've been able to demonstrate we can increase morale, reduce disciplinary referrals. We're also showing that we can reduce turnover in buildings. We've been in buildings that when we started had 30 and 40% turnover in staff annually. And we've been able to show that we're demonstrating shifts with that. When we do surveys with staff in the buildings we're in, what they're saying is that their workplace is changing and they feel more supported and more hopeful in their work. So it becomes a morale issue as we start to deal with this. What I have up on the chart here is here in Washington, this is a look at our standardized test results in elementary schools, where we pulled the results for 3 matched groups of schools to the 9 intervention schools that we were in this one year in Washington. The red dotted line is the change in the pass percent rate for the entire state. The green, yellow, and gray lines are our comparison groups. And the blue line is our intervention schools, our 9 intervention schools. What we were able to demonstrate for English language arts is that we're actually able to show in 1 year a mean percentage increase of 9 points on passing rates in our 9 intervention buildings, where our comparison schools were actually generally flat or showing a little bit of a reduction. To my knowledge, this is the first time that there's been any information that would suggest that actually trauma-informed practices can change academic outcomes. But the reason why this is so critically important is that schools are academic institutions. This is their mission. If we can't show that we can improve on their core academic function, it's an open question why it is that they want to make these investments. So to end, I think that there are a number of opportunities, including an increased lens on needs, improved match to services, schools as the hubs for community change as a critical issue, but there's some risks. So we could create a new form of stigma in terms of using trauma concepts poorly. We have to better address the issue of disproportionate risk in diverse population. And there's the risk that addressing trauma could result in self-incrimination and an adversarial process. For example, I do not support the issue of universal screening for trauma because we don't have control and safety mechanisms in place in schools to protect that data. So let me end there and we'll open up questions.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. We do have a few questions rolling in, but everyone out there, please use your questions pane to send us comments or questions. So Chris, the first question is around whether or not this work can be done at the school level and with parent involvement.
We think that the issue of parent involvement is absolutely at the heart of this. We would view ourselves still as pretty active learners about how to do that work effectively. The position that we've taken in our work is that the relationship of the school to the parents and caregivers of their children is theirs, not ours. And we need to stay very closely paced in any recommendations we have to the history and the ambitions that the schools have about how to deal with this. Our experience has been that the way to move this forward is to help the school stabilize around these concepts so that the teachers become very effective in terms of being able to communicate this through their own words as they're working with parents. But what we find is that as the kids start to have a different experience around this, parents get engaged. So we have done things about co-sponsored with the school, doing parent education nights and doing Brain University in order to deal with this. What I would tell you is we don't approach this through the lens of trauma when we're dealing with parents, and we're not trying to be cute with language. We just don't want to reinforce this issue of loss. So we really approach this through what do all kids need for development, and then through the lens of what stress does to us. And stress becomes a little bit more neutral term. It's not as likely to be off-putting. But the key issue with parents is that mostly parents of kids who are struggling with this continuum of complex trauma impacts are themselves kids who grew up in those kinds of circumstances, and often they have very poor experiences with schools. So the issue of how do you actually use trauma-informed practices to create a different kind of an experience for parents becomes a critical task.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, would this approach also work in foster care shelters? And is the CLEAR approach listed in any national registry for evidence-based programs?
We're not at the point of getting to the evidence-based practices with this. I think one of the great frustrations so far for me has been we've been moving so quickly to try to respond to interest, and I think that that's common to almost anybody who's been working in trauma-informed practice, that interest is outstripping our evidence base right now. So we have some preliminary evidence that is certainly encouraging. We're hoping in the next 2 to 3 years to get to the more rigorous research that's necessary to actually get into blueprints for prevention and the SAMHSA NREP kind of registry, which is kind of the gold standard for how to get to these things. So no, not there yet. And the only place we're in trauma-informed practice where we are is, again, when you start to look at programs like CBITS, which are these very targeted mental health treatments. And there are some examples of how trauma-informed practice has been advanced into the registries.
Okay, thanks. The next question is there more formal detail or published paper behind the observation that the engagement and support of school principals is critical, if not foundational, to even attempting to implement?
There is a big literature on the role of leadership in educational practices and innovation generally. So I think that this is just a half step over in thinking about the trauma-informed practice. But what I would point you to is if you Google CAFRU, which is the name of the center that I run, Child and Family Research Unit, on our research page, one of the pieces of work that I had actually done for the California Endowment, one of the funders of MARC, was a selected review paper about educational practices and policy and trauma-informed school interventions. And I point you there because actually one of the sections is I address some of the leadership literature and education and the crosswalk to the trauma-informed practice. So it would be a place where you could at least dip in and try to get some easy references to then follow up on.
Okay, great. Actually, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I actually stepped on responding to the previous question about the issue of translation into foster care or shelter kinds of issues. What we're finding is our experience about how you work with a complex system is starting to feel pretty universal about the pressure points in the sequence. So we do think that these are translatable lessons. A lot of our direct professional development approach, we're adapting into working with primary care staff. We're also doing this in workforce development work. So we are finding that the core concepts, the core skills development kinds of approaches, although what coaching may look like and how you sequence training may differ across settings, we are finding that these are actually very translatable lessons that come across a range of systems.
Okay. But you mentioned going to the CAFRU website for the research page. Perhaps this is where we can direct other participants. So people are looking for the article on the standardized test results versus matched schools graph, and also the implementation model from early on in the slideshow with the triangle. Is that where they should go over those?
I think that you'll see it embedded, the implementation science work you'll see embedded through most of our documents with this, but I'd encourage you to go directly to the National Implementation Research Network website. It's hosted at the University of North Carolina. It's a very deep resource. The implementation science work can be heavy sledding. It's a little dry, but it's actually been some of the most practical and rewarding concepts that we've ever worked with, and I can't recommend it enough as a framework for thinking about how we keep advancing the work.
Okay, the next question is, what has been done at the high school level? It seems most of this work is focused on elementary schools, which are smaller with more of a sense of community.
Yeah, it's a great question. So of the 40 sites that we've been in, a little more than half of them have been elementary buildings. I will say that I think it's an easier sell in early learning and in K5, K6 buildings. And it's right to the point of how the person wrote the question, which is the relational environment in early learning in K5, K6 is just a lot more supportive of this kind of work. We have been in both standard education high schools and in alternative high schools. Actually, ironically, we found, and to say ironically because of some of the complexity and needs issues you would think of with students, but we found alternative high schools to be relationally a lot more like an elementary school, and as a result, it's an easier fit of these concepts. What I would say right now is the big nut that we're trying to crack in the high school work is how do you create the relational framework? So it feels achievable to us, but it is not principally through a classroom experience as the first place that you deal with it like you would in an elementary school, because a single high school teacher may see 150 or 200 kids in the course of the day as they roll through their preparations. But if you approach it more through a high school community lens, then there are ways to start to think about how you create some of the relational structures. So simple things like having every adult in the building with each incoming freshman class be assigned 10 kids that it's their responsibility for their entire high school career to check in on a weekly basis. Is a relational framework that can be intentionally created that starts to kind of shift this issue about reinforcing what we think is really the centerpiece of trauma-informed practice. Probably not the sufficient condition, but it certainly is the necessary condition, and that is high quality and consistent relationships. So we think that there are ways to deal with this, but we've built our high schools in a different model, different frame, and a lot of that is really predicated on this idea of autonomy and independence in practice, and where you don't want to steal that from anybody ever. It is something where we're finding this issue of how you create the relational frame inside high school is a whole body of work that all of us need to get better at.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. I have a few more questions in the queue. Maybe I can follow up with you offline, but we are out of time today. I really thank you again for joining us, and any closing words?
It's my pleasure. If I can be helpful to anybody who's on the call, feel free to reach out to me. My email is my last name, Blodgett, lowercase, @wsu.edu.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. And everyone, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Bye-bye.